So basically, they were looking at this idea of trying to understand why an LLM does what it does, or like why a neural network does what it does. And the most atomic unit of a neural network that's natural to talk about is the neuron, right? So you have a single neuron that fires or it doesn't fire. So in this scenario, they, in this picture here, they've got a whole bunch of text and they've highlighted various tokens with different intensities based on how much this neuron number 83, in sort of a toy network, fires when ingesting this kind of text. And the point that they're making with this diagram is that it fires a lot, right? Most of this text is lit up. Some of it is lit up quite intensely. But you can tell that this neuron is firing a lot of the time. And so they call this like a polysemantic neuron. This neuron is like active in a lot of different cases. It's not just to do with one particular feature. And that can make neurons really, they can make it very hard to figure out what a neuron's actually doing, right? Because if a neuron's firing all the time in the most extreme case, or if it's firing none of the time, then what's it even doing there, right? In the extreme edges, if a neuron never fires, it's obviously not interesting because it's not doing anything ever. And in the case of it always fires at 100%, it's also equally uninteresting. But it fires like a lot of the time or a bit of the time for many, many different unrelated things, then that can also kind of be hard to understand what it's trying to get at. And so we call these polysemantic neurons. And essentially what this paper was trying to do was, can you discover monosemantic groupings of neurons? Because a neuron is not a very natural way to think about how a neural network actually works at the scale that humans want to think about it, right? Like when we analyze the brain and we look at like brain imaging, okay, partly we can't see individual neurons fire, so that's why we do it. But we like to think of it in groups and areas and things like this.
So what we're looking at right now, for context, is we're looking at a neuron in an LLM that is firing when it's generating queries, citations, HTTP requests.
When it's ingesting this text.
Right. And so that's interesting because they seemingly don't seem correlated to my first glance. And so trying to understand why it's firing is the interesting thing, right?
That's basically it. And when you think about one neuron in 70 billion, that's really hard.
And can you explain the neuron concept for LLMs? Like, I guess I never really thought about it, but like an LLM has neurons just like our brain. Is there any differences between the two things? Or they just
between the neuron in the brain and the neuron in an LLM? Huge differences. They're I would call it skeuomorphic at best. But the idea behind a neuron in a neural network in sort of the field of AI is that you have this activation function, which we'll get to in a bit, but basically it's either 0 or it's 1. So this activation function will either put out a 0 or a 1. And typically you get this sort of build up of inputs, and once that build up crosses a certain threshold, then suddenly it'll activate and it'll spit out a 1, right? And those inputs come from all of the neurons in the previous layer, or some subset of the neurons in the previous layer. So you can imagine all these neurons are linked together in this big directed acyclic graph, and you sort of take a weighted sum of all the inputs of the previous neurons, and then that tells you, that's your accumulation. And if your accumulation passes a certain threshold, then you fire and you output a 1 to all the neurons that you're connected to. And those weights is exactly what a neural network is learning over time. So when it's training itself, what it's doing is it's learning what those weights are so that it can fire at the right time in response to the right inputs. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so.
Cool. And so what this diagram is we're looking at is like, when is this neuron firing and how strongly is it firing, right? Because there are a bunch of pathways through the neural network that reach it. And you've got this sort of big weighted sum of that pathway, and that'll ultimately decide whether it fires or not. And so what they want to do is they actually want to achieve something called monosemanticity, which is where a neuron or a group of neurons only fires for one particular kind of feature. And the notion of a feature can be fairly abstract, but they have this really cool picture here, which is a clustering of all these different features and how they get, how neurons fire in association with them. So you can see that this cluster on the bottom left fires very strongly when it's thinking about DNA sequences, right? And it doesn't fire strongly when it's thinking about anything else. Whereas over here, it's firing very strongly when it's thinking about numbers and commas, right? So probably something to do with like comma-separated values. And then it's got areas that, even though a lot of it's just text, it's got areas that are focused specifically on funding, acknowledgements, things that are focused on nutritional statements, things that are focused on legalese. So like legal language is distinct from, other normal human language. And so you've got these clusters of neurons that fire more strongly for these types of features than for anything else, right? Now, there is a little bit of overlap, and they did some work previously as well, understanding that overlap and breaking features down into something they call superposition, which is very, very cool, but probably not worth diving into here. But essentially what they figured out in this toy networks was that they could train neural networks, in this case a sparse autoencoder, to basically force the network to learn in a very, very specific way, such that groups of neurons, when they fire together, will only fire together if a certain type of feature is present. So you'd have this cluster of neurons, and it only really fires when you're talking about DNA. And another cluster of neurons that only really fires when you're talking about legalese, right? And another cluster that only fires when you're talking about making HTTP requests over the internet. And the reason they want to do that is it's nice to be able to break these concepts down into monosemantic ideas, right? Things that have one meaning. This group of neurons really only deals with this problem. The reason you want to do this is that you can understand how the neural network is working. You can understand what it's actually learning. You can understand how to improve it, change it. And they're particularly interested in safety features as well, because you can sort of break down different areas of the neurons, and maybe you can disable certain neurons that you think are going to cause safety issues. And they did this other cool thing where what they did was they took a input, right? Let's say the number sequence 1 to 10, and asked it for some transformation, and without any intervention, it outputs some numbers, also comma separated, right? This is the autoencoder trying to do its thing. Fine. No intervention. It's taking in numbers, the areas of the neural network that are monosemantically involved in dealing with numbers, they fire. If, as the neural network is running, they perturb the Han Chinese area of the network, suddenly it outputs Chinese characters. And if you perturb the DNA output area, then suddenly it outputs DNA sequences. If you tweak, if you sort of activate the area that's dealing with uppercase, then suddenly you get a bunch of uppercase letters. And so what they were showing here is that you can actually start, composing these different features together, or these different monosemantic things, to sort of group them and get like a result out that is some combination of the two. And there have been other attempts to do this with embeddings, where people have shown that if you look at the distance between like mum and dad, and how an autoencoder sort of tokenizes those two concepts, the difference is actually very similar to the difference between auntie and uncle, right? So the gap between auntie and uncle is mathematically very, very similar to the gap between mum and dad, which is kind of interesting, right? Because you can imagine that an auntie is just like an auntie is to an uncle what a mum is to a dad, right? So there's already been these ideas in tokenization, but doing it in a live neural network was quite interesting. And then recently they proved that they could do this with a much, much larger system. And so they're hoping to scale this up and up and up. And eventually these, 70 billion language parameter language models that we have no idea how they work. They just kind of take input and they produce a bunch of output. Hopefully this is a step in the right direction to understand what it is they're learning, where they are encoding those learnings, and then most importantly, how you might perturb those parts of the network to alter the output that you're going to get. And it's not just safety requirements in terms of, saying, well, we don't want, a neural network to output information about how to make a bomb, let's say. But it's also just simpler than that. If you took a enterprise database and you trained an AI on it so that your company could ask questions about how your company works, that's a fantastic idea. But how are you going to deal with sensitivity of information? You don't want to be able to query what everyone's salaries are, right? But maybe you want that to be possible for the person that works in HR. So there are sort of these caveats about how do you understand what the neural network has learned, and how do you section off those parts of the neural network and say only some people are allowed to access outputs that perturb this part of the network.
Yeah, this is awesome. Are they saying that naturally, as you train the neural network, there are clusters that form that have monosemantic meanings essentially, or it just naturally forms, like this cluster will address this thing? Or is that a deliberate design decision? And I guess, are there LLMs that there isn't possibility of that clustering happening? Because I guess in the brain, I don't even know if that clustering is possible because they haven't really shown too much correlation. Like sometimes it fires in random locations, right?
I wouldn't take the brain as a great.
Right.
It's a great for inspiration, but I wouldn't say it's a great analogy. It stops being a good analogy very, very quickly. The more I've studied biology, the more I've been convinced that neural networks are just skeuomorphic to the brain.
Okay, so brain aside,